Hello there. Yeah.
Mute video.
I'm sorry, there's a feedback. Hi, Ben.
Hello, Angie. How are you?
Yeah, great. How are you?
Good. Is it good morning or good afternoon there? It's morning, isn't it?
Yes, it's before 8 o'clock in the morning.
Before 8 o'clock. Wow, you're keen on the weekend.
Yeah. And today is Sunday. How's your weekend
Sunday
so
morning,
far?
8 o'clock. It's beautiful here. It's 20. We're at coming up to 11, as you know, and it's 20 degrees and sunny.
Wow, that's great. 20
yeah.
degrees is just right, I guess.
It is just, it's been, because it's been such a cold spring, wet, cold, and it's got some sunshine today, so.
Would you like to test the screen first before we begin?
Yes, so I'm not going to try and play a video. Michael had a video of a patient, but I wasn't going to mess with that because we had trouble getting it to me. And so I'm just going to use the PowerPoint. So where are we? Share. How do I do that? Share screen. Is that how to do a PowerPoint? I share the screen, don't
I? You can share your screen right now. Yeah.
Share screen will stop other participants' computer sound share. Do you wish to continue? I'll just go. What have you got there?
I can see your folder, and there are several PPT. Yeah.
No, I've got two screens, so it's one. It's that screen. How about that one? What have you got there?
It's still the same.
Oh, is it the folder?
Yeah, maybe.
I'll stop it and I'll try and share it again.
Yes.
What have you got there?
Yeah. Yes. Right now I can see your slide. The front part of your slide.
Okay. What about now? Is that the screen? Yeah. Is that going through the slides?
Yes, it's already full screen, and I can see the.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and that's great.
And you can hear me okay, and you don't need my pic. My picture's not up there, is it? You don't need my. So I can change that, can't we? We can.
No, this is okay. You can maybe for.
To start with.
Yeah.
So if I minimize that, what have you got now? You can still see the screen, can't you? The slides.
Yes, yes, I can see the screen as well.
Okay. When I click that, what have you got now?
You stop the screen share.
Yes. What have you got on the screen now? What can you see?
Your face.
Oh, me. You got me again. Okay.
Yes.
So if I go share screen, and let's just try it again. If I go.
Okay.
Does that pull up the slide?
I got presenter view of your screen share. So I can see.
Oh, okay.
Next slide, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the bottom of that screen. So if I go to. What have you got there?
Now I can see the whole share screen. Do you want there's a screen, then your face inside the screen, just like what you did in Google Meeting?
Yes. So how do we do that? That's a setting, isn't it?
Yes, it's a setting. When you click share screen, you can, after that, you can click advanced. Then PowerPoint as virtual background. Can you see it?
Hang on. So advanced. More.
So it's one inside the options in the share screen. So when you click the share screen on the top, you can see three choices: basic, advanced, and files. Then you can click the advanced one in order to find options.
Sorry, I'm not seeing that. Display settings.
Another way to do it. I
can't see that advanced screen.
Have you clicked the share screen, the green one on the bottom of the...
Click the share screen.
Oh, you end the share screen first.
Oh, stop it.
You should end it first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now you click the share screen button. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Now the advanced, yes.
Yes, yes.
And then I go video.
No, the PowerPoint as virtual background. Do you want that?
Yes. Yes.
So the PowerPoint will be as your background when you talk.
Oh, okay. And then share that.
Yeah.
Oh, which PowerPoint? Okay, that's going. How's that?
Yes, yes, I can see your slides and you inside the slides.
Oh, good. So
yeah. It's just like what you did in the
oh, it's still loading them.
Microsoft, yeah. Yes, I can see you clearly.
So how do I advance the 2, 3? Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
good.
Brilliant. Great.
Good. That's why we jump in early.
Okay. Can you stop your share screen first? Because we need to open the session.
Okay. So if I stop that, and then when I go to start it, I just click share screen and I'm just doing PowerPoint virtual background. Okay.
Yes, correct.
Good.
Yeah, brilliant. Good. Thank you, Ben.
Hello, good morning, Ben.
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine here. We are fine here. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. It's very early there, 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, but it's usual for us.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah. So
and
you're
all in the hospital, are you, or the university?
In the university.
Right.
In the university training center here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You've got some workshops there as well as some Zoom presentations.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And yesterday, Prof. Baijan presented a very amazing presentation about gradual exposure therapy.
Yes. Yeah,
and
good.
Thank you so much.
Did he play the video of Robel?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is
good.
that your patient?
It's I know him, but he's currently the inpatient. So he's doing the inpatient program. Yeah. I met him. I referred him in there after I met him. But yes, that's good. I'm glad he did that.
Yeah, and we think it's a very good method of presentation. So share about the patient, and the participant will see about the interaction and also the gradual exposure method and about assess the craving of the patient.
Yes, good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I heard you are on leave now?
Yeah, only till Monday, just a couple of days.
Oh.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are waiting and for the participant who will attend offline here, and then we will start at 8 a.m.
Okay.
Okay, Ben. Thank you, Ben.
No problems.
Yeah, the participant will be divided into two, the one that's offline here, and there are some of them also attending it online.
Okay,
so
right.
Maybe you will see like some of them in our video there, in our webcam there. Then some of them also in the Zoom room right now.
Mm. So
I would like, yeah. And then I would like to introduce you to our moderator today. She is one of our registrar in our department. So here she goes. She is Belinda Juliet. Yeah, Belinda.
Hello.
Hi, Ben.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'll be the moderator for these sessions, and we will begin shortly, like in 3 minutes probably. Is that okay?
Yes, yep.
Yeah. Okay. Selamat pagi para hadirin sekalian. Selamat pagi para hadirin sekalian. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Perkenalkan, saya Dr. Belinda, dan pada kesempatan kali ini saya akan menjadi moderator untuk memandu jalannya workshop medis terkait gambling disorder yang merupakan salah satu dari serial rangkaian acara Addiction Masterclass The Series 2022 yang dibawakan oleh tim Divisi Psikiatri Adiksi FKW RSCM. Acara workshop hari ini merupakan program terakhir dari serangkaian acara Addiction Masterclass The Series bertemakan Management and Recovery of Gambling Disorder, Escaping the Perpetual Cycle of Craving and Harm pada tahun ini. Sebelumnya saya ingin mengucapkan selamat datang kepada yang terhormat Dr. Christiana Sister, spesialis kedokteran jiwa konsultan selaku Ketua Departemen dari Departemen Psikiatri FKUI RSCM. Kemudian selamat datang kepada Dr. Angeline Hanafi, Bachelor of Medical Science, spesialis kedokteran jiwa, staf yang merupakan staf divisi psikiatri adiksi FKUI RSCM, yang juga merupakan ketua acara dari Addiction Masterclass The Series 2022 ini. Dan narasumber pada hari ini yaitu Dr. Ben Riley dari Flinders University, Australia. Welcome to our international speaker, Dr. Ben Riley. We are honored to have you here in the Addiction Masterclass this series this year. Dan selamat datang kepada seluruh peserta yang saya hormati, para dokter spesialis kedokteran jiwa yang hadir pada pagi ini, baik secara online maupun offline. Selamat datang di acara workshop Gambling Disorder dengan tema Management and Recovery of Gambling Disorder, Escaping the Perpetual Cycle of Craving and Harm. Acara pada hari ini terdiri dari dua bagian. Bagian pertama merupakan introductory lecture di mana partisipan akan mendapatkan kuliah umum dari Dr. Ben Riley yang akan terhubung melalui Zoom. Sesi ini diikuti secara paralel oleh seluruh partisipan workshop, baik yang mengikuti secara on-site ataupun online. Untuk sesi pertama akan dibawakan dalam bahasa Inggris dan akan ada sesi tanya-jawab setelahnya. Setelah sesi pertama selesai, partisipan workshop yang mengikuti secara offline, yaitu di IMERI FKUI saat ini, bisa langsung berlanjut pada seksi workshop di ruangan ini. Sementara untuk partisipan yang mengikuti workshop secara online akan break terlebih dahulu karena sesi workshop online akan dimulai pada jam 1 siang ini. Demikian untuk daftar acara hari ini dan kita akan memasuki sesi pertama yaitu introductory lecture. Good morning and welcome to our introductory lecture of the Addiction Masterclass, the series workshop. My name is Belinda and I will be the moderator for this section. This lecture will be presented by Dr. Ben Riley from Psychological Therapy Service, College of Medicine and Public Health, Flinders University, Australia. Dr. Ben Riley graduated from Adelaide University for his Bachelor of Music, and he also completed Bachelor of Social Work and also Master of Mental Health Science from Flinders University. And he also completed PhD program from Flinders University College of Medicine and Public Health. And currently, he is a senior cognitive behavioral therapist, team manager, and also research coordinator from Flinders Psychological Therapy Services, statewide gambling therapy service, center and anxiety-related disorders, Aboriginal gambling therapy service, and also full-time AHP3. For this lecture, Dr. Ben Riley will present about the introduction to CBT for internet addiction. And after this lecture, we will have Q&A sections directly. So if you have any questions for online participants, you may type your questions directly on the chat box in the Zoom. While for offline participants, please keep your questions first to be asked in the Q&A sessions later. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ben Riley. The time and place are yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you this morning on a bright, early Sunday morning. And so I'll be talking to you about cognitive behavior therapy for gambling disorder. And so the aims of our brief time together this morning, I'd like you to be able to use the model that I present, and we'll go through it. I'll go through it several times with different disorders, with gambling disorder, but also with anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. It's the cognitive behavior model that we use for gambling disorder is similar to the models we use for other anxiety-based disorders. So I'm going to go through how we conceptualize gambling disorder using a CBT model. We'll touch on some cognitive strategies, how you would conceptualize it for cognitive, and also for behavioral strategies. So first of all, why is it important that mental health practitioners know about gambling disorder? We know that there's a high prevalence of mental health conditions among patients that present with gambling disorder. But what about the prevalence of gambling disorder among patients with mental health issues? So those that aren't necessarily presenting with gambling problems, but just in a community mental health setting. There hasn't been a lot of research, but there has been some, and there's some from Australia. So this one, researchers looked at patients presenting with psychotic disorders in a community mental health setting, and they found that people with psychosis were 4 times more likely to have a gambling disorder than the general population. It's another study, an Australian study, and they surveyed all patients in a community mental health service. So I imagine you would have something similar there in Indonesia. There are hospital-based services and community-based services. So they looked at it was several hundred patients that were receiving mental health care, and found that they were 8 times more likely to have a gambling disorder than the general population. So among patients within mental health settings, they are much more likely to have a gambling disorder than the general population. So that's why it's important for gambling disorder to be screened for all mental health patients presenting for help, regardless of what they're presenting for, because they often don't talk about it. Now, these couple of slides here, I think are worth just touching on. It's only very recently that the interest in gambling disorder, in gambling problems, are taking much more of a public health approach. And much the way we do with alcohol, for example. So with alcohol, we don't just tell people how to get treatment when they're experiencing harm. We advise people what the safe levels of consuming alcohol are. So these are a bit dated now, but so in Australia, for example, it's 14 drinks a week. In Canada, 15, France, 21, and so on. So these are the guidelines for safe, low-risk consumptions of alcohol, but they're quite dated. This is from 2011. In fact, the latest guidelines from Canada that have only been released earlier this year have actually, they've brought theirs down from 15 to now they're recommending 6 drinks per week for males and females, and no more than 2 drinks on one occasion. So they've almost halved their, what about, but that's been overlooked for many, many years with gambling. So what are the guidelines for low-risk gambling? Well, Canada did some research, their public health center did some research a few years ago, and in Australia, they've, some researchers in Victoria done some research, and that's been released only earlier this couple of months ago, the most recent one. So we now have some, they haven't been sort of promoted in the public yet, but we're hoping that's the next step. So what the guidelines are, so there's the 2. So this one on the left looks at like gambling overall. What are the safe levels of gambling? And the one on the right for different types of gambling. And that came out in June, I think, this year. So what are they? They're actually quite low. They're a lot lower than I imagine they might be. 20 to 30 times per year. Expenditure, $380 to $600 a year. No more than 0.83 to 1.68 gross personal income, and no more than 2 types of gambling. So that's for low risk. Any more than that, and people are at risk of developing gambling disorder. And for certain types of gambling, slot machines, $300 a year, or $35 per session. Horse racing, $450 per year, 16 times a year. I mean, these levels here, someone with a gambling problem, a gambling disorder, they'll spend that in one bet. So it's sports betting, $400 a year or 14 times a year. So it's just worth having in mind. These are guidelines for low risk gambling. So what about gambling disorder? So people that develop a gambling addiction, there's a number of different approaches. There's involving family, like family therapy or significant others. There's stimulus control, which is somebody managing their money or Exclusion orders, there are those available here and in other countries where people have a ban going into the gaming room, the gambling venue, but or that the treatment is, the most recommended treatment is cognitive behavior therapy. So what we've found, this is some research from Flinders a few years ago. There's cognitive therapy and behavior therapy, or exposure when we talk about behavior therapy. And what we found is that both work well. So both cognitive therapy alone and exposure therapy alone both work well. But what we found in this study is that exposure therapy worked slightly quicker, and it had better rates in longer term. But I'll explain. So I'm going to touch today on some cognitive therapy and some exposure, and then explain why we think starting with exposure therapy as a first line is more helpful. The first part of any cognitive behavior therapy is to perform a functional analysis or a functional assessment. So essentially, and you would do this whether you're applying cognitive or behavior therapy. So what we're doing here is eliciting the information that we need to provide the patient with the conceptualization. And I'm going to show you the conceptualization, but this is the first step. And so you're asking them, and this is not just gambling, this is with an anxiety problem or whatever the problem is. But so with gambling, what we're looking at is the trigger. Specific incident over here is the trigger. So the gambling. What happens before, during, and after the gambling? And we're interested in the physical, the autonomic, what happens physically, what behaviors does the patient perform, and what thoughts. So what are they feeling, thinking, and doing before, during, and after the gambling? And I've just got just an example to show. So this is just an example. So a trigger might be, you might ask the patient. So typically you would ask them to describe a recent gambling incident, a time that they remember very recently. And let's say they say, oh, the trigger was, there was a football game starting and they had their phone. What were you feeling before that? Oh, I was a little bit excited, restless. What did you do? I looked at the website, looked at the statistics. Often that's common. And then what were you thinking before you put the bet down? I'll just bet a small amount, just a small amount. Okay. Then what happened during it, during the bet, during the gamble? What were you feeling? Was you nervous? Palpitations? Was feeling tense? What did you do? Placed $50. What were you thinking at that time? It has to win. It must win. And then afterwards, what did you feel after the gamble? The urge was less, it reduced, and I felt sick. Often they feel depressed. What did you do? I checked my bank account. What did you think? I'll never do that again. So once you have that information, you can then go to the model. So here, the triggers. So is that full? Have you got all the boxes there on your screen? Just somebody hold their hand. Yes, okay. So the trigger at the top, trigger, money, phone, football game on. And you would draw this in front of them. You would draw the trigger, then you draw an arrow. That leads to arousal, excitement. That then leads to the thoughts about gambling. I might win. Thoughts about gambling increase the arousal. So the person gets more and more excited. What do you think happens as we get more aroused? We have more adrenaline and anxiety in our bodies. Do you think it makes us think more logically or illogically? it makes us think more illogically. If we have lots of anxiety and arousal in our bodies, we think more illogically. That creates more arousal. And see, this cycle goes around, and that's what we call the urge to gamble. And the urge to gamble for the gambler, it's a little bit exciting, but it's also an adverse state. It's a feeling that they want to get rid of. They want to remove. It's not a pleasant excitement. So that then leads to the behavior, and the gambling relieves that urge, like scratching an itch. Every time the person gambles to remove the arousal here, it increases the salience or the strength of these triggers. So the next time the person contacts the trigger, bam, that's it. They feel the arousal again. So then how would we conceptualize it using using thoughts as the main thing? Well, you just swap these two around, the arousal and the thoughts. So that would look like this. The trigger sets off the gambling thoughts. The gambling thoughts lead to arousal. Arousal leads to more illogical thoughts. The person then gambles to relieve this feeling, and then so forth. So it's a simple model. We've been using it for many years, and found it to be very, very helpful. Particularly patients will look to see their problem, sort of usually use a whiteboard, or you can use it on a bit of paper, but a whiteboard it's often usually very helpful. So let's look at it at another example, just to show you how in another context. If we applied the same model to obsessive compulsive disorder, would look like this. The trigger might be door handles or cupboards. Person touches the door handle. That leads to arousal, anxiety, sweating. That leads to thoughts, and the thoughts, I might have an infection. Those thoughts make them feel more aroused. Leads to more irrational thoughts, more arousal, and that goes around and around, and it feels unbearable. And they have an uncontrollable urge or a compulsion. The behavior they perform to remove this state is washing, and that relieves this anxiety. Whilst it relieves the anxiety, so that's negative reinforcement, whilst it relieves the anxiety, it relieves the compulsion, it strengthens the salience of these triggers, these cues for the next time. So the next time the person contacts the door handle, the arousal comes very quickly and strong. Let's apply it to something else like a panic disorder or agoraphobia. So we've adapted the model to gambling, but the model's been around for many, many years. But so here we go. This is so for panic or agoraphobia. Trigger, typically it might be a crowd, busy shopping centre, catching a bus or a train, leads to arousal. Thoughts about being trapped, having a panic attack, dying, leads to more arousal, more anxiety, more illogical thought, more arousal, and in here is the panic attack. Nobody likes having a panic attack, and when someone's having a panic attack, they'll do a behavior to remove the panic attack, and typically with agoraphobia or with panic, it would be escape. You might close their eyes or run to the bathroom. That relieves this feeling, but strengthens the trigger for the next time. And so that's a very typical cognitive behavior conceptualization and model that we've adapted to use with a gambling disorder. And so essentially, the compulsions, the urge for a gambling disorder and the behavior, we conceptualize similar to the compulsions with obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, I know that a compulsion has some distinct differences to a gambling urge, to a behavioral addiction. Mostly that compulsion the person doesn't do because it's pleasurable or exciting. They do it because it feels horrible. Where within a behavioral addiction, the person does the behavior. It's uncomfortable, the urge, but it's also a bit exciting. So there's a difference between an urge within a behavioral addiction and a compulsion with OCD. But nonetheless, they can be conceptualized in a similar way, and the treatment essentially it looks very similar to the way we treat OCD. So this, Michael might have gone through this yesterday, this one, but this just shows, and this is often a good one to show a patient, that when the arousal is low, our thinking is logical. As our arousal gets higher, the thinking becomes more illogical. It's very difficult. Like an example is in the middle of a panic attack, it's very difficult to think logically. When there's a lot of adrenaline, we can't think logically. And so the idea with a cognitive approach is to work on the illogical thoughts that lead to lower arousal, lower urge. With a behavioral approach, we work on the urge, and if we reduce the urge, the thinking is more logical. So they're both, work in different ways. So for a cognitive approach, this is not obviously not exhaustive, but the main ones would be to use cognitive restructuring. So targeting irrational beliefs about the ability, the patient or the gambler feels that they have the ability to control the outcome of a game. So we would use cognitive restructuring. Essentially, that's about studying the evidence. So you wouldn't tell the person that's not true. You can't control the game. You would ask them questions. So you're curious. You ask them, so tell me more about how you believe you might control the game, and get them to talk about that openly and ask them lots of questions. So often they'll believe that the only way to solve the problem with their debts is to win more money back. And so the only way to solve it is to gamble. So then you would ask, okay, is that the only way? What else? What other ways might there be? And ask them to when they're aroused and they're stressed, they can only think one thing. So the cognitive therapy, you're asking them just before they move forward anymore, just let's talk a little bit more about that. Tell us, are there any other ways? And just get them to talk. An example would be, okay, and eliciting the gambling cognitions. So there's lots of things you could ask, but I've found these are really two helpful questions to ask. Why does the patient choose their type of gambling? Often they'll enjoy talking about that. So why do you choose horses? Why not slot machines or casino games? Why horses? Almost always there's a reason, because they feel that they have a little bit more advantage. And so you ask them, why do you choose that? Tell me more. And then you'll hear them start to talk about that and just get all. And another question that I found is very useful is, often the gamblers with a problem they'll select their own horse or their own sports team. And you ask them, would it be any different if somebody else selected your team or your horse or your numbers? Would it be any different? Almost always they say yes. Would you let someone else pick them for you? They will almost always say no. Why? Well, because they think they have some skill. They have an advantage if they select their own horse. Just have a think. Do you think if somebody studies the horses for many years, and they study horse racing for many years, let's say for 10 years, do you think that gives them any advantage in putting a bet down and winning money? Just ask us that. Just think about that for a moment. It's useful to have some evidence to present to patients that believe that. Often that's a very fixed, a very firm belief. So I just thought, so we'll go through that in a minute. But so this is an example. I mean, there's different thought diaries, but typically they have 5 columns: the situation or the trigger, the thoughts, the emotion, and this is where the cognitive restructuring is here. So you would ask them questions about these thoughts to see if they start to change them. So it might be the situation: I got paid, my team will win. I'm going to wager $100. I feel excitement, I feel urge. And then you ask them about this thought: my team will win. It will win. Do you think it absolutely will win? What other thoughts? What are the other options? Well, does it win every single time? Or maybe it might lose. And what if it loses? What do you think would happen then? So you're just asking them to, when they say that thought, just to ask them more and more about that, to talk more about that. And they'll start to say things. The longer you talk to them about that, they'll start to say things like, well, maybe a team might not win. I actually could lose $100. And then what would happen then? What do you think might happen then? Well, if I lost 100. So you see, you're just getting them to reflect on these thoughts. And they feel less excitement. Another one, trigger: I received a bill. The only way I can pay this is to win money gambling. They feel urge and they feel nervous. And you would ask them, is that the only way that you can pay that bill, is to win money? It's the only way. Well, I wonder if there are other ways. What do you think? And then you ask them more and more about that. Well, there are other ways. What might those other ways be? Or I could talk to the creditor, talk to the bill, maybe go on a payment plan. Typically, that's a cognitive approach would be, so you're looking for those thoughts, the automatic thoughts, and then speaking with them, having the time to talk with them about that. And then the diary is for them to write their thoughts down. And it's useful to have some, I'm very happy to send, although you've got these on the slides anyway, but to send these articles, but it's useful to have some evidence to present to them. So there was a range, this was done many years ago. So Ladicure looked at horse racing, and in this study, they looked at gamblers that had 10 years or more experience betting on horses and compared them to a group of people that knew nothing about horses. And they got them to pick out a whole range of hundreds of races. And then they looked at the outcomes. And what they found is that the expert bettors picked slightly more correct winners because they bet mostly on favourites. But when they looked at the monetary outcomes, when they took the bookmaker odds into account, there was no difference between the experts or the novices. And they've done a number of, they don't do these studies anymore with horse racing because they know the science is very clear that being an expert in horse race and studying the form does not give an advantage. The same research has been done with hockey in Canada. It had the experts were no less likely to pick a correct winner or to win money than novices that knew nothing about hockey. This was English Premier League. They asked a group of soccer fans to predict the first 10 games in the English Premier League football matches, and they compared those to a group of people that knew nothing about soccer. And they found that the experts were no better at making accurate predictions or winning money. It made no difference at all. So having knowledge about the game did not give them any advantage. It's interesting, isn't it? So it's useful to have those, to have that, because with cognitive therapy, you don't argue with the patient, you merely present the evidence and allow them. So having some evidence is useful because you can say, well, you know what, there's, in fact, what the big sport in Australia is AFL, Australian Rules Football. And we often have patients with gambling problems say that they believe that if you know a lot about Australian football, you will win. So they bet on Australian football. So we've, rather than argue with our patients, we would never do that. We thought, let's create our own evidence. Let's do our own research to find out. So we're writing this up at the moment. So you get a first look. So this is, we looked at 6 seasons of AFL football games, so 1,157 games. It equated to about 4,500 individual wagers. And we compared those with expert tipster data, which we sourced from the internet. So they're usually journalists or expert commentators. And I actually entered all this data when I had COVID. I was locked in a room for a week. So I entered thousands of games in my week of isolation. And so then we ran a $2 simulated bet and then compared a random selections with a random number generator to see if the experts were any better. We predicted that the expert tipster would predict a greater number of correct games because we know that home game advantage and team ranking are two variables that are useful, but we predicted there will be no differences in monetary outcomes once the booking odds are taken into account. And what we found was that the experts made slightly more correct predictions, 63% compared to 52%, but both made net losses. So both the random number and the experts had net losses overall. But when the booking odds were taken into considerations, the expert losses were 28% greater than random selection. So having expertise in Australian football, you actually do worse than random selection. And we're hoping that sort of evidence, when we publish that, we'll be able to present our patients with that. So with sports betting, there's a distinction between accuracy and monetary gain. Accuracy reinforces their illusions of control, but it doesn't help you win money. Accuracy in predicting a correct win does not equal winning money when bookmaker odds are taken into account. And that's the thing that the gamblers often don't consider. This one here is a very common gambler's belief. If I gather more information about a game or a horse, I will have a greater advantage in making a correct prediction. I found that one quite difficult one to shift. The more they study, the more they talk about variables. The more variables the gambler believes, if they have lots and lots of variables, it will give them advantage in making a correct selection. So this is just a way of explaining to the gambler why that doesn't work. You won't find it in a book. It's just a way I've developed, and I'm going to share that with you now. So I talk about variables. So if you think of a pipette, we call them, or a little and if you've got some dye, some food coloring in that, they're your variables. The gambler believes that if they have lots and lots of variables and put, let's say if they had 12 or 15 variables and they drop them into that glass of water, it's going to have an effect on the glass of water, isn't it? It'll change its color. And that's what they believe that they're doing. Where someone that doesn't have their variables, random number, wouldn't be able to change the color. But what's actually happening is they're placing the variables not into a glass of water, they're placing them into there are infinite number of variables available. So if they place those variables into that swimming pool, is it going to affect the change of water? Not at all. And that's why there's no difference. No matter how much they study, they cannot influence this. Comparing that to that, that's why all the study doesn't make a difference. I found that a helpful way to you could even have a bucket in your office or a small glass of water and actually get them to do that. And then when they go to gamble and study, they see, well, it doesn't matter how much I study, I'm not going to be able to have an influence over the outcome. However, the urge with gambling disorder, it can escalate very quickly, like someone with a panic disorder. So often it comes very quickly, it shoots up very high. And we know that when it's very high, can't think logically. So that's why it's a challenge to use a cognitive approach to start with gambling disorder. The same way with someone with a panic disorder, you'd start with a behavioral approach, exposure. Once the panic attacks are less, you could then start using more of a cognitive because the arousal is too high. So that's why we always start with a behavioral. So this is the model again. So the trigger sets off the arousal, irrational thoughts, more arousal, urge to gamble, gambling relieves that urge. This is just another way of conceptualizing it, that comparing it to OCD. So trigger, person touches a door handle, they feel arousal. It's an unpleasant arousal that compels them to the behavior is washing their hands. It brings them relief, but also they feel sad, even though it relieves it. Someone with a video game addiction, the trigger, they feel aroused, and it's not just excitement arousal, it's an unpleasant arousal. They play the game, the urge diminishes, and then the mood drops because they're, if they've been in their room playing games for 18 hours and not neglecting other parts of their life. And then the gambling disorder, conceptualized the same way. Trigger might be money, arousal, gambling behavior. I'll get my head out the way, relieves that. So that's the behavioral conceptualization. It's just another. So conditioning interpretation of cue reactivity for addictions is, with gambling, it's nothing new. It's been around for a long time. There's some early research in the early 90s. They've looked at people with alcohol disorders, preferred brand of alcohol, they exhibit arousal. And with cigarettes versus neutral cues, even preferred branding of cigarette for the smoker creates arousal. So cue reactivities in addictions has been around for a long time. Cue exposure assumes that the cue reactivity is classically conditioned. People without gambling problems show increase in arousal in heart rate in response to gambling behavior. Cue reactivity is an unconditioned response to the stimulus of gambling behavior itself. And so cue exposure, neutral cues become conditioned stimuli. External cues, there are both external cues and internal cues. Repeated exposure to the conditioned stimulus without the associated response, so with response prevention, results in extinction of the conditioned response. So gambling cue reactivity is extinguished through repeated cue exposure with response prevention. So the first step would be to develop a graded hierarchy of gambling cues. So with horse racing, might start with pictures of horses, although most of the gamblers that I've treated, it's tends to be racing, like there's statistic pages on the internet, and they don't even have to be current statistics, just the page. So racing.com is a very common one. So you ask them, because initially we thought, if we just show them pictures of horse racing, sometimes, but for internet gambling, it tends to be more this one here, the odds statistics. And if you show them an image of that, often they'll feel that arousal. So what you might do is if you're testing that out, is ask them just, if they're sitting quietly in your office, in your room, ask them just to notice what they're feeling in their stomach. And often I'll present them with a picture of a beach or of a tree, just something neutral. And then, so you could set up a PowerPoint slide with a neutral picture, and then flick it over and click it over to the image that you've chosen, you want to test, and then ask them if they feel any change in reaction in their body. And usually you can see it on their face, they'll feel it. And that's what you're describing to them. That's that cue reactivity. That's really what we're treating. So grading, it might be an images. The image just printed out of the betting site. Then you might move to the image on their actual computer connected to the internet, because that's another level up. They'll be more aroused because it's connected to the internet. Might be then holding their phone, holding the phone. And then it could be actually watching a race, could be another level up. Another one is watching the horse race, but turning it off before the race finishes, and then sitting with that feeling of they don't know who won the race. That's often can be a good one. So what about casino games? So these are some things that we've found useful as far as graded cues. It might be the image of the website that they use, pictures of the mode, whether it's blackjack, whether it's roulette, casino chips. We have some of those in our offices for people that go to the casino, and we'll get them to hold. You can buy them at some toy shops have some gambling games. So holding, or even a deck of cards. If people gamble on cards, having a deck of cards could, and actually holding them can create arousal too. So this is where we'll explain this to them, that there's a trigger. The gambling trigger sets off an urge to gamble. The arousal comes up. They gamble. The arousal comes down. Next time there's a trigger, urge comes up, they gamble, it comes down again. With exposure therapy, what we're doing, we're wanting the trigger to set off the gambling urge, but for the urge, that arousal, to settle down and habituate whilst they're focusing on it without gambling. And if they do that repeatedly, the urge will get less and less and less. Not sure whether Michael went through this yesterday or not. The golden rules of habituation, it must be graded. So we've talked about that. So we start with something small. It must be focused. And focused means that the person must focus on the urge, on the gambling thoughts. Simplest way to explain that is if someone was doing habituation to, let's say, snakes, and they had a picture of a snake, they mustn't look at the picture of the snake and close their eyes or think of other things and distract themselves. We would ask them to count the scales and touch the snake and actually let themselves feel frightened. They have to confront it and allow habituation to happen whilst they're focusing. So with gambling, with a gambling trigger, they must let themselves feel that urge and allow it to habituate whilst they're focusing on it. Prolonged, they need to sit with it until it passes, until it's come right down, and then repeat it over and over again. So this here is a treatment diary in our CBT workbook. We have a workbook that we give, and we ask the patient to note down each time they do their exposure exercise. So this first one here, let's say they've done, what's their urge before they look at the picture? 0. During it, it came up to 6. They focused on it, and then it habituated, it came down to 2. That might take 20 minutes, half an hour. The next day, they do the same thing. It's come down a little bit less. The next day, they do the same thing. It's a little bit less. 4th day, there's not much at all. Habituation is that way. Repeated habituation, extinction. And so then they would write picture number 1 up there. And then once they've done that, you move to the next cue. How many times do they have to do it? Well, we did some research a few years ago now. We had, in this study, there was 45 patients that used exposure therapy, and they did really well. They all got better. And we found that the average number of sessions was 7. So they came and saw the therapist. So it's a pretty brief intervention, isn't it? 7 sessions. They range between 3 to 13 sessions. So 7. In this study, we were looking at what's the main ingredient in exposure therapy that gets people better. And what so we looked at the average time they spent doing their homework over those 7 sessions, 6.6 hours of homework. And they performed 17, on average, 17 exposure tasks over those 6 to 8 weeks. and that got them better. So it's a relatively brief intervention, isn't it? In this study, we controlled for the control variable. This is the important thing. We controlled for the number of sessions. We controlled for education. Half the population here had not finished high school. We controlled, a third of them were taking psychotropic medication. We controlled for that, controlled for gender, age, and we took a questionnaire, a validated questionnaire on treatment expectancy. So that's placebo. People expecting to get well, does that make them well? Does that get them well? Does number of sessions, people that attend more sessions, do they get better quicker, more, and controlling for all of these variables, we found the only variable that was related to their improvement was the time spent doing their homework. People that came to 3 sessions and did lots of homework did better than people that came to 13 sessions and did very little homework. So what's this all about? This is about informing with CBT. It's important to inform the patient that doing the homework is what gets them better. It's very important. Other forms of counselling aren't as homework heavy, if you like. So it's important for them to do the tasks, to do the exercises in between the sessions. This is a way you can use to measure the arousal to the gambling cues. It's just most people have a heart rate monitor. A lot of people have them on their watches now, but this is one you can get on your mobile phone, and it can just read your face. So you can hold it up and actually show and get the reading on the person. Just the camera takes the heart rate. And here's one I did a couple of months ago with somebody, and you can see the resting heart rate. That's just holding the phone up. The 74, and then presented them with a gambling image up to 84. And this similar, the one you can't see behind my head, they're 54 up to 83. It's quite a big jump. When the patient sees that increase, often they're not aware of it. With a gambling disorder, often they're not aware that that's happening. With an anxiety disorder, patients are very, very aware that the anxiety is there. With gambling, they're not, so being able to sort of illustrate it like that can be very helpful. And just a couple last slides. We've started, the use of virtual reality can be useful in exposure therapy, but also in cognitive, in asking people to talk about their gambling-related thoughts. And you can do it in a safe environment in your office. We use them in the inpatient unit. Those pictures there, that's me testing it out on a Star Wars game. I have a lot of fun with it when I'm not working, of course. And so there has been a growing literature on using the use of virtual reality with addictions. And so there's been lots of studies on nicotine, a few on alcohol, and then cocaine. There's only one on gambling. So we're hoping to contribute when we have the time. So it's showing some promise. So it's nicotine's been the most widely studied to date with use of virtual reality, and things like, and they've shown that actually just with 5 individual sessions, this research here showed that using VR exposure, because you can do it in a safe way, because obviously they're not ingesting smoke, and it was effective. And so things like they'll get people to sit at a table while other people are smoking. Stand at a bus stop and someone will offer them a cigarette in the headset. So it's got some promise. So we believe it's got potential with gambling disorder, but it's early days. So this is some of the sites we've been using, online gambling sites. There are a number of them in the virtual reality. So the patient can walk around the casino and habituate. It's quite effective. And it's sort of fun. It gets people involved. Patients quite like it. They can sit at a table and be dealt out chips and things and habituate. And you can grade it too, because they can sit away from the machine, and then they can walk up to it and they can sit at it. And you can sit, and if that's too overwhelming, they can just take the headset off. So in summary, CBT is a brief intervention, 6 to 10 sessions we find. It begins, regardless of whether you're using a cognitive or a behavioural approach, it begins with a good functional assessment. That functional assessment elicits the information that you need to formulate the conceptualization. So that model that we've gone through a number of times, yes, the first assessment is aimed at eliciting the information you need to fill in that model. So I always have that cycle that we've gone through a number of times, always have that in my mind when I'm doing the first assessment, because I want to elicit the information I need to put into that model. So you're asking them the triggers, the arousal, the thoughts, the behavior. And then after you've done that, you move over to the whiteboard and you explain the model to them. It's collaborative. You present, discuss the model with the patient, and homework is essential. It's a crucial part of doing CBT. Some time for some questions or...
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Riley.
So maybe I should stop the share, should I?
Thank you, Dr. Riley, for a very insightful lectures. And now we are starting the question and answer sessions. Maybe because there's no questions in the online sections. So we are going to open a Q&A sessions from the offline participants. So, Dr. Riley, there is one question from the participants here in the on-site place. So the question is that, is it possible for the patient to do the graded exposure exercise at home, or the graded exposure should be done in the clinical settings with the therapist? And secondly, if a patient, for instance, at the middle of the graded exposure therapy, and then she or he couldn't handle the arousal during that time, what could be done for that patient? Thank you.
Good, thank you. Good question. So the first one, does the patient do the exposure exercises at home or in the clinic? I would test it out in the clinic and show them how to do it, but then they would be instructed to do them at home, usually 5 times a week. So they perform them at home, and then record their urges and in the treatment diary, and bring them back to the next appointment. And the next session we go through that. So you show them in the clinic, and then they do that at home. The second question is, if the arousal, if it gets too overwhelming, what should be done? Well, then, of course, they can just stop the task if it's too much. And then we would regrade it. So then we come back to those 4 golden rules. The graded, we need to regrade it. So maybe start with something even smaller. I tend to start with something very, very small, so that doesn't happen. They don't feel overwhelmed at home. So sometimes we'll show them a picture, and they might say, in the clinic, not much of an urge from that. And then I'll almost always say, well, show them how to do it with that. take it home and test it out at home, because contextual cues are very powerful too. We didn't talk about that today. So contextual cues are things like the room of their house that they gamble, it might be their bedroom or the lounge room, or when no one is at home, all those contexts, the time of the day. So when they take that same image that they look at in your clinic, if they take that same image home, it might generate more of an urge. So I always start with a picture, and if they get nothing in the clinic, I'd say, look, show them how to do it, take it home and test it at home, and then I would instruct them. If it's too overwhelming, stop it. We'll talk about that next time and then regrade it. The other important thing I didn't mention, and Professor Bajent may have mentioned this yesterday, it's important to have that when they do the exercise, that they don't have all access to their money. If they have a purse or wallet full of cash, or when they're doing the exercise at home, we don't want that to be dangerous and then go out and gamble. So we talk to them about keeping their money safe whilst they're doing the exercises. So they might give their bank card to somebody to hold while they do the exercise at home. So that's the other important reason why it's graded, so that it's not overwhelming, it's not too much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Riley, for clear explanations. So it is possible to do the exercise at home after being explained first at the clinic, and then they can test it at home. And if it is too overwhelming, they can talk about it later in the clinic, and we can plan another thing to do, right? Yeah, okay. Now I'm gonna read the questions from the online chat. So there is a questions about how about the pharmacotherapy guideline for gambling disorder? Pharmacotherapy guideline for gambling disorder. As this disorder, it looks like the OCD, probably like the treatment choice for the gambling disorder, doctor. Thank you.
Sorry, what was the question?
Is about the pharmacological treatment for gambling disorder. Yep. As we can see that there is a similarity between this gambling disorder with the OCD.
Yes. Oh, so pharmacological treatment for gambling disorder, right? Because of the similarities with obsessive compulsive with OCD. Yes, yeah. There's not a lot of evidence that medications are a standalone treatment for gambling disorder. So there's been some research on the use of naltrexone, but it's not very convincing. Certainly the use of SSRIs and antidepressants can help with the mood and the anxiety associated. As far as it's a good question, like the medications for OCD, like like low dose antipsychotics, Zyprexa or something, olanzapine, low dose for OCD, can that be helpful with gambling disorder? The research hasn't been done, but it's a very good question. But certainly antidepressants for the comorbid mental health problems. But no, I'm not aware of any research that has looked at, say, low-dose antipsychotics as we would with severe OCD and gambling disorder. I'm not aware of any research, so I can't answer that, but we don't have the evidence. It's a good question.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Riley. So we treat the symptoms that the patients experience, like the anxiety, depression, and stuff. And then while for the antipsychotic itself, like in the OCD, there's no clear research yet. So we can probably wait for this. And then for the next questions, Doctor, there's a question about what kind of homework that could be given to the client for each sessions, and the type or the example of the homework that could be given. Like for instance, you already mentioned about the cues exercise, graded exposure of the cues, probably the other homework that could be given to the patients.
Okay. So the homework, well, if it's using exposure therapy, the homework would be doing the exposure exercises. So they would be given one trigger to work on for that week until it's extinguished. The next week, we'll give them another trigger and so forth. If it's cognitive therapy, the homework would be the thought diary, the restructuring diary. And there was an example in those slides of, so you would ask them to, when they feel like gambling, to write down what are their thoughts, and then the column on, and then look at some alternative thoughts and then write those down in those columns. So they sit down and spend some time, 20 minutes, half an hour, writing their thoughts, gambling thoughts down, and looking for alternative thoughts. So that would be the homework for the cognitive. But the homework for the behavioural would be the exposure. We tend not to mix up cognitive and behaviour homework in the same week, so they have, because it can be a bit confusing. So usually keep it separate, but you might use it later.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ben. So for the homework, there are two kinds. The first one is cognitive one, and also the behavior. And then so we can keep that homework separately, so it cannot be mixed up. Okay, for the next questions, maybe from the on-site, is there any other questions? Okay. There's one question, Doctor, from the on-site participants. So she asks about how about if the patient have the co-occurring disorder, for instance, having gambling disorder along with the alcohol dependence. Like, how about the treatment? Could it be done like together in a same time, or we should treat each disturbance for once?
Okay, good question. It's a very good question, because substance use problems are often present with a gambling problem. Not always, but it's common. So the answer to that is, so with cognitive behavior therapy, there is a large emphasis on doing homework. So you need to assess whether the alcohol use is at a high enough level that it's going to impair the person's ability to do the homework. So if that's the case, then treat the alcohol first. If they're drinking heavily, but you think they'll still be able to do their homework and actually learn, because CBT is about learning, isn't it? So if they're able to still learn and do the exercises, do their homework, then you would treat the gambling first. So it depends. It's the same with alcohol use, and the same with if they're using diazepam or some of the other prescription medications. If they're using it to a high enough level that it's going to impair their ability to learn and retrain themselves, then that needs to be addressed first. So it wouldn't be, if they're with alcohol disorder, we can't treat that. We can't treat their gambling. We must treat. It depends on how, if they're able to do their exercises and do their homework. And you might then start treating the gambling and see that they are still not doing their homework because they're sleeping in too much, because they're drinking and they're not. Then you think, okay, we need to actually address this first. So it's, yeah. Does that make it's not the same for everyone? It depends.
Thank you, doctor. And then for another questions, So there is a question whether is it possible for graded exposure therapy to be used in the methamphetamine use disorder to reduce the craving or not?
So I missed that last part of the question, sorry.
So the question is it possible for graded exposure therapy to be used in the methamphetamine use disorder to reduce the craving for the patients?
To reduce the craving for what disorder?
Methamphetamine.
After methamphetamines.
Yeah.
Good question. There is evidence for Q exposure with alcohol. I'm sure there's some evidence with opiate use 20, 30 years ago, some early, not very much, but there has been some. Certainly with nicotine, there has been. Alcohol is the most widely studied addiction other than gambling with Q exposure. Short answer, I don't see any reason why not. I think it would be very, very, because a lot of the time with addictions, with substance addiction, once the craving, the biological craving the drug is out the system, it's the psychological cues that often lead to relapse, isn't it? So treating those with Q exposure can be really helpful. With nicotine, studies have compared nicotine patches with nicotine patches and Q exposure and found that the Q exposure with the patches in long-term follow-up did better because people are learning to desensitize to those cues. So one of the problems you have with substance addiction and say with someone with a methamphetamine disorder addiction would be the response prevention, stimulus control that we need with Q exposure. Often there are a whole lot of other social and lifestyle complications with someone, say, with a methamphetamine addiction or opiate addiction that can get in the way of treatment and coming to regular sessions and doing the homework. So there's no reason why it wouldn't, but they just might. With gambling addiction, it's a lot simpler. So there's no reason, technically, there is no reason why not. So I would use it. I've used it with alcohol. I would with nicotine. I'd definitely consider using it with methamphetamine, but it wouldn't be without its challenges. So.
Okay. Thank you very much for the explanation, Doctor. And for the one last question from the on-site participant from Dr. Satya.
Jadi misalnya orang itu gambling di kasino, tetapi juga horse race betting, pacuan kuda, dan sepak bola, populer sepak bola. Nah itu bagaimana reading exposure-nya bareng atau satu persatu?
Okay, so there is a question. If the patient, for instance, have multiple gambling disorder, I mean that he or she, for instance, having like horse betting and then having like casino, there's a lot of gambling types. Which type of gambling that should be first for these patients? Like, what's the consideration to treat?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Often with a gambling disorder, there will be multiple forms of gambling. Remember from those low-risk guidelines earlier on, one of the risks for developing a gambling addiction is gambling on more than two in a year, more than two different types. So if somebody's gambling on more than two types and they don't have an addiction, they're at more risk of developing one. So often they will present with multiple types of gambling. to answer the question, it doesn't matter which one you start with. So think of the principles of exposure. So grading. So whichever one creates the lowest level of arousal, start with that one first, because we're grading. So and also ask the patient where they would like to start, because it's collaborative. So there's no right and wrong. It's but it's important to grade it. So whatever yeah, where they would like to start and grading it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, doctor. And then, sorry for, there's another.
Jadi kasinumnya beres dulu, baru pacuan udahnya beres, baru udahnya.
So, doctor, for the there is a follow-up questions for the prior one. So, if the patients have multiple types of gambling, like should be the graded Q exposure be done simultaneously or not? For instance, for the horse betting together with other things, and I mean the Q is given simultaneously to be tested or to be exposed, or one first horse riding until finish, and then the other types of gambling until finish, and so on.
Yeah. So I would tend to give one at a time. So if you had a horse racing picture and a casino picture, one at a time. So grading might be, so which one of those two images, which one is lower, creates less arousal, start with that first. They extinguish that, move to the next one, they extinguish that, combine both of them and see if that together might increase. So you would then do both of them. So you're kind of building, you're starting from small and then building up. And you kind of, it's a bit of trial and error. You sort of, you're testing it as you go along. So the general rule is start with the one that's the lowest. And I would do one at a time rather than to, if they really want to do two, then then they should do them individually, like one day do one, and then in their treatment diary, they write, this is the picture I used, and then do their treatment. The next day, use the next one. But I would tend to just give them one at a time because, you know, you give people some homework in CBT land. Same with physiotherapists too. They give people homework. You ask them to do it 5 times over the week. Generally, you'd be lucky if they do it 5 times. They might do it 2 to 3. So our inpatients, we might do simultaneous because they're doing it all day intensely, and they've got. But outpatient, I would tend to just do one at a time and keep it simple. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, doctor. So we can start with the less arousal one, and then we give it one by one, and consider probably combining later on. Thank you, doctor. And then one last questions from the on-site participants. Okay, doctor, for the questions is about is there any some kind of tips and trick to dispute the irrational belief or thought during our session with the clients, because sometimes during the clinical practice, it is very hard for us to help the patient to dispute that beliefs and developing the new alternative thoughts. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah. So was the question, just to clarify, was the question, are there any things to help find the thoughts? Because they're unlikely to elicit them, to get them. Yeah, yeah. One of the things I will always ask is I'm always interested in why the person chooses that particular type of gambling. I gamble on horses. I say, well, do you ever play lotto or slot machines? And if people that bet on horses, they'll prefer it for a reason, or sports. If they say, I only bet on sport, what type of sport? Basketball mostly. Why basketball? Why not? And then ask them, do they ever bet on a sport that they've never heard of? And if they say no, why not? They might say, well, because I know nothing of it. Well, how does knowing something of it, does that help, do you think? Oh, well, and then they start talking about that's one of why they gamble on that particular one. And the other question, would it, if they bet on, like some people that bet on lotto, usually they select their own numbers, lotto numbers, right? What if somebody else picked the numbers and it was a big $1 million lotto? Would you let someone else pick the numbers? Oh, no, usually no. Why not? And then ask them to talk about that. So you're just asking them questions. Curious. Tell me more about that gambling. Tell me more about what, so you're just asking them and they'll start talking. Yeah. So, but why they gamble on that particular gamble? For sports and horses, what do they do before they put the bet? Do they do any research? Do they do any reading of the form of the statistics? If they do, usually they do. They usually, the gambler that's addicted doesn't walk in to the betting and with like this and just go eeny, meeny, miny, just pick one. Usually they do some study. Ask them about the study, get them to talk more about that. Just curious, I'm interested. So what do you do that for? Why do you read that? Tell me more about that. I don't understand it. Are you asking them just genuinely outcomes and all those beliefs? And then we know from the evidence that we've gone through the research today, no amount of study has any impact on their ability to win. We know that. So you're getting them to talk about that. You then have that evidence to present to them later on. You can say, well, what do you think about that? How does that fit with all the study that you do? Yeah. But you're right, sometimes they're a little bit shy to talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Riley. So if we stuck in this kind of situation, probably we can just keep asking to the patients and ask them to tell us more about the gambling habits so we can get more insight from his or her conditions. Okay, thank you very much. This is the end of the Q&A sessions. Thank you very much, Dr. Ben Riley, for the introductory lecture. So to conclude this section, so we learned that there is increased prevalence of gambling disorder in patients visiting the community mental health services rather than general population. So it is important for clinicians to do screening as well for the gambling disorder. And nobody, even the experts from the particular field that people having gambling on, could predict the result. So in CBT, the general concept is to dispute the irrational belief or thoughts. But firstly, before doing that, we also need to make the functional analysis to comprehend more about the patient's conditions. And the most common gambler's belief is about the illusion of control. And for the therapy, through the repeated cue exposure, whether it is prolonged, graded, or systematic, it will lead to the habituation and leads to the extinction of the behavior. Okay, therefore reaching the end of our first sessions, and we will also have the documentation session with our international speaker. So the committee will do this session's documentation through Zoom, screen capture. So for all the participants joining us in Zoom, please do turn on your video camera feature. While for the participants joining us in this room, please stand up and gather here in front of the LCD screen. And for the next 1 minute, we will have some screen captures done by the committee. Mungkin dokter boleh berdiri.
So when we will have a picture here, but it's quite tricky to do it. But you should just sit back, wait for our instruction. We'll try to move the people so that all of them could be in the picture. Untuk para dokter yang hadir secara online bisa buka kameranya kalau berkenan.
So we begin by the speaker and the offline participant first. 3, 2, 1.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ben Riley, for your nice presentation. We are very delighted to have you here in the Addiction Masterclass series. And we hope to see you again next year in the AMCS 2023.
I hope so. Pleasure. You have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
See you again.
See you. Have a nice weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Terima kasih para dokter. Sekarang kita akan memulai sesi workshopnya. Mungkin yang akan offline saat ini akan mulai saat ini juga, dilanjutkan nanti sampai sekitar pukul jam 12. Lalu sedangkan untuk partisipan yang ada di online nanti akan mulai jam 1 siang ya dokter. Nanti boleh meninggalkan Zoom ini dulu dan boleh masuk kembali, Zoom-nya dibuka jam 12.30. Ya, terima kasih dokter. Mungkin kita sebelumnya dulu kita bisa ini dulu mendengarkan beberapa aturan kuliah introduction dulu dari Dr. Christiana Sista dan juga Dr. Angeline. Ya, izin dokter yang nanti akan bergabung secara online boleh meninggalkan Zoom. Nanti akan boleh masuk lagi jam 12.30. Untuk kuliahnya nanti juga akan diadakan terpisah, dokter. Izin untuk yang online dan offline.